thing to follow up on Christian, and you already said, some of you already said, well, what an excellent talk. But I do hope that I have some things to add, and maybe put some specifics onto the theories that you laid out. And in some ways I was thinking, oh well, I could almost have used many of your headlines to structure my talk, but I didn't have enough time to do that right now. So I hope will take you with me, and then we'll hopefully have some time to discuss afterwards. We already heard about planetary urbanization, and in some ways this is probably an ideal image to show what is happening. These are global oil flows. And these global oil flows obviously go hand in hand with global financial flows. But what I'm interested in is actually the physical environment, the spaces that result from it. And so what I've tried to look at both through the research on port cities and through the research on oil is to see how commodity flows connect buildings, physical structures around the world. So when you see this and you translate it into built form, well, this is maybe what you get. So as you're looking at the highways of the United States or Europe, the buildings they actually fund, or we fund as we drive these highways, are the buildings in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, and other places around the world that we then go to see and admire. So there is a very dense network of different industries that are connected in the production of what I call these petroleum scapes. And in some ways, this is not even brand new. This is a caricature from 1904 showing Standard Oil, today's Exxon, as this octopus grabbing for all the main industries and political decision-making centers of the time. So you have the Capitol, you have the White House, you have the steel industry, railways, etc. And what I've been trying to do in this research on the petroleum scape is to come up with a systematization. So as we've already heard, it's no longer about studying a single city and how do we define that, or a specific type of architecture. I think we lose our power of historians, planners, designers, if we just stay with one locality, because there's way too many connections that are around the world. So the way that I've been trying to think about it is to think about the petroleum scape as a connection of different elements. So on the one hand, there is the industrial space. And most of the time, this industrial complex is huge. It is over acres or hectares of land in the ports, within our, within inland and other places. But that is not what we usually see. Most of you might have driven by on a highway and you see some storage tanks or refineries in the back. But if I asked you, who's actually visited a refinery? Well, who has visited a refinery? Okay, so out of what, 100, 200 people, there's maybe one or two, and you probably had a lot of luck and some people helping you to get in. Because it's really, really complicated. So those are not spaces we see. We might get some nice shots out of an airplane when we land, but that's also very hard to do. So these are huge, but generally not visible, at least today. Now, what do we then see of the petroleum scape? Where is the handshake that sort of takes place with this material? And it's only, in my mind, the retail, the gas station. And when we think of it in terms of architecture, that's like a cute little flimsy thing, and it's associated with all kinds of other memories. It's about, well, in Germany at least, Sundays the shops are closed, so you need some milk. Well, the gas station is open, and there you can get what you need. So it's a very different thing, and it's something probably even for you associated with memories. Oh, they hand out Lego cars, I really want those, or those kinds of stickers, so I get my dad to drive to that specific station. But that's mostly a modernist architecture style. It's very industrial. So as much as the industries are a global structure, the refineries are globally the same. Tank stations, gas stations are modernistic architecture, but they switch, they adopt locally. But once we get into the administrative buildings, they are yet in a different place. The administrative buildings are often built by conservative architects showing the power of the money and the power of the company. And they speak a very different language. So usually, in an architectural history, you wouldn't bring these kinds of typologies necessarily together. But it goes on. So there are auxiliary buildings. Sometimes in the world, oil builds housing, oil builds religious buildings, oil builds movie theaters, but only if they really have to. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. And that is also one of these points of trying to find a different location in your thinking. Because if you think only out of Europe, then there's very little places where oil builds entire cities. But once we go into China, into Russia, into Iran, and we think from those logics, then we see a very different petroleum. And it goes on. The architecture of plastic. I think that's one of my most recent fascinations that I'm probably going to do the next thing about. And then there's philanthropy, but that's a very American thing. So there's a lot of money that is being spent by Rockefeller, in the name of Rockefeller, on philanthropy. And to look at how there's parallels or not, the ways that the company is working is yet another facet. So what I've been trying to do here, and you could call it also, or you can set it up in the ways of Lefebvre, that on the one hand you have the spaces of oil, then you have the representation. And that is the second line below. So the representation is about what do you actually see, and that also shifts among cultures. As I said, most of you will not have played a puzzle to put together a refinery, or even send out postcards with a refinery, or use stamps that show you pipelines. But that are things that are happening in other parts of the world where you're constructing an identity on the fact of having oil, or on the fact of building entire cities around oil. But still, and I'll go through these more in depth throughout the talk, but I just want to give you the sort of thought framework first. Architecture is inspired by it, artists represent it, and it's everywhere in popular culture. So those could be from the spatial to the representational, and then we actually have the represented, as Lefebvre would argue, and that's a category that I really want to work on in the future, or get help from others thinking about it. But there's a lot about language and imaginaries and thought processes in our mind that actually plays to that. And when I had my students make mental maps of their way from home to university, almost everybody will have a gas station in there. And almost everybody will say at one point, oh, turn right or turn left at the gas station, because it's the thing that sticks in our mind. These are such flimsy buildings, but they are very visible, and they attract our memories. So I made an exhibition on this topic, and this is Rotterdam, oilscapes in Rotterdam, which we showed in the museum there, which has now been traveling to a couple of other locations in the Netherlands, and will also go on to Germany. So let me take you, now that I've set up this more general framework and what this is about, let me take you to the actual places, and let's look at them more closely. So we first said the industrial complex. So what does that entail? Well, usually we're out there somewhere in rural areas where they find some oil. And this is the place, Titusville in western Pennsylvania, often called as one of the first places where industrial drilling started. It has traditionally always had oil. And we should all keep in mind that oil is a natural product. It has been, Marco Polo carried it around the Silk Road. The Greeks have used it as Greek fire in battles. In Mesopotamia, bitumen was used to stop water from seeping up. So it's always been around, but it's been around because it was on the top of rivers, it was bubbling up from the ground, but what changed it is industrial drilling. But once you get this stuff out of the ground, what do you do with it? Actually, in Titusville in the beginning, they drilled into it, it shoot out of the ground, and they didn't have barrels to catch it. So it was just flowing off, and nobody really knew what to do with it. So it took some time to develop the infrastructures that would allow to get the raw stuff, the crude oil, to the users. And that is one of the really interesting patterns in this whole story, the infrastructure. And most of the time, the infrastructure leads. How can we get stuff somewhere? And that's where the oil industry will also invest. So in the beginning, you might have these flat boats swimming on some of the rivers. Then they develop barrels. You have railways. But the problems with all of this stuff only occur to them through time. Fires. Oh, we didn't realize that we shouldn't leave this stuff laying open in the sun, and it just occurs, fires occur, or other pollution types. But I just said infrastructure is the key to understanding this story. And many of the geopolitical features of our time or of the 20th century have been shaped or co-shaped by oil. The Suez Canal in the beginning was not built for oil, but it has since become a major element in the transport of oil and in the connections between the administrating, the owners, who are in Europe, and the former colonial territories, for example, in Indonesia. So, Royal Dutch Shell Company, has its headquarters in The Hague and in London, but the oil of the Dutch was in Indonesia. So the ships had to come all the way back, and the territories, so the hinterland that you were discussing, is thousands of kilometers away for the production sites and the users all the way up in Europe. And there, Shell is an interesting phenomenon because it's composed of an oil company, Royal Dutch, and a transportation company, Shell. And as they merged, we have the company that we have today. And Shell was the very first to get this ship, the SS Murex, through the canal by having a tanker ship instead of using barrels, which would have to go all the way around Africa. So infrastructure is key, but I would argue that the one thing that really anchors the petroleum scape in space is the refinery. And the refinery, this is one of the very earliest ones. This is the Belmont refinery on the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. This is the same thing that we still do have today. So petroleum, using water, is heated up and separated, and then shipped at that time in barrels with horses or on the railway to other locations. So the practice of just heating, separating, and using the different products has stayed the same. It's become much more complicated. The refineries we see have nothing more to do with it. But it's a huge investment, and it's a huge time commitment. So when we think today about getting rid of a refinery, well, those things are built for 50, 60, 100 years. So it's not something when we make a decision today that we can change tomorrow. And so one more thing that I wanted to add on this, refineries and oil and water go hand in hand. Refineries need water for the process, and they need water for shipping. So often these refineries are located on rivers. And this is another refinery in Philadelphia, further down on the Schuylkill River, because the Belmont refinery is one of the few examples of a refinery that disappeared. And there's a pattern to that. So the earliest refineries were often located upstream, so above the water intake of cities, which is not very healthy, as you can imagine, if you let all the debris float in the river and then you drink it. So those refineries were relocated to the other side of cities. So in Hamburg, Rotterdam, Philadelphia, you have this process. But once they have found their location on a big river for production and transportation, they will stay. So this refinery here, built in 1870, is the longest still running refinery in the world. So this thing has been running for some 150 years. So we have no idea how the ground below it looks and what it would take to actually clean this up. But when we see it in the beginning and you look at land use map, it says, oh, apple yard, refinery, apple yard. So this was a rural, if you say, or suburban business, because they had to take it out of the cities for environmental and fire concerns. But it's also the place where 50% of the global oil was shipped to China, or to the world at that time. So Philadelphia was a huge oil exporter with the oil coming out of western Pennsylvania. And this is how it looks today. So how are you going to get rid of a structure like that? Sunoco tried to sell it in 2011, couldn't find a buyer, they sold off their network. The city absolutely wanted to keep it running because of the jobs attached to it, so they created a local company, and because of the fracking in northwestern US and Canada, they have been bringing in by rail petroleum through the entire United States into the center of a city of some 5 million inhabitants, basically putting into danger every time a train comes in, 1 million people would have to be evacuated should something happen. So it's a moment where you have a spatial decision made 150 years ago that will determine contemporary flows. And so this kind of landscape, we have it everywhere, but it's mostly unseen. So here's the landscape of Rotterdam, for example, on your right. Now, these global structures are very different from the ones that we usually see. So our little gas stations, well, they evolved in the beginning as cute little buildings as people started to drive. So let's not forget that this big refinery that I just showed you was about lighting oil. For the first 60 years, 50 years, the only thing they really produced, or the main thing they produced, was lighting oil. As electricity came around, well, oil had to find a different purpose. So the car came right in time. And one of the things that you see in the oil story is that there's so many chemists involved who will come up with new needs. Every time we think, oh, we've stopped oil, we'll find a new thing to use it for a different purpose. So cars are the new next thing. And cars, highways, and gas stations then go hand in hand. And we have either very little flimsy buildings, or some countries, like the Netherlands, already in the 1920s, people who were protecting the natural areas, the landscapes, asked to have nice-looking gas stations. So they asked the big companies to employ some famous Dutch architects to build good design. So Siebold van Ravenstein, for example, here builds this one, and there's a number of other Dutch architects who get to build 100 gas stations. And there's some fabulous ones, like the one on the left is next to the headquarters of what was then Exxon. It's torn down, it doesn't exist anymore. The one to the right has now become an architect's workplace, and they are protected heritage sites. So if we think about what is the story we tell about our culture, well, this is a place where we really celebrate heroic oil. But those kinds of little cute icons, those are not the ones that lead us through the world. By the 1970s, the gas stations had understood that they needed to be globally recognizable. And they came up, Michelle made a really nice film about this, with click-on walls. So almost any structure they could just push on their company colors, well, red and white here, and yellow and orange, or whatever it is. And I had an interesting conversation with a Mexican in Belgium recently, and he said, well, I feel kind of lost. I miss my national oil company colors of the gas stations, because, well, they are whatever, forget what they are, but they are not the ones that we will usually see in Europe. So these are kind of the mental maps, the iconics that we see, and up here you might have more Statoil or Shell down in Europe. But what are the buildings where the decisions are being made? Because you talked about big regions, and this is also something we see here. On the one hand, extraction occurs in one location, but this extraction really doesn't matter. I mean, who has heard about Pithole? Who has been to Pithole? Okay, Titusville? World famous Titusville? No. Well, but these are places that shoot out of the ground in western Pennsylvania. Within a month, they had 10,000, mostly men, a few women with other professions, working in the oil industry. And as soon as the oil was gone, these cities disappeared. Pithole today is only a plaque in a green field and some trees around that says, here stood the city of Pithole. Titusville had the first oil exchange, and they really hoped that they would grow into a major city. But what happened as oil was drawn to Philadelphia and to East Coast cities, the port cities, the money was drawn to New York and the headquarter cities. So in that sense, the extraction just didn't matter anymore. So those are the places we'll think about for headquarters. Standard Oil, the big iconic building with the lamp on the top that lights over the harbor, or in this case, London, or here the Shell headquarter in the Hague, which is a large building with underground connections, so that they can even trick Greenpeace, by the way. And this is the former headquarters of Exxon that I just showed you. As you can see to the left, the gas station is still there, but it has changed its form. It's actually quite interesting that most headquarter buildings have their own gas stations nearby, so that's another thing I want to follow up on. And as architecture changes, we have, well, then in Rotterdam, places, new designs, or the last erection of capital, as somebody called it at the time when it was built. And I heard yesterday that the Helsinki, that in Helsinki is an oil skyscraper. Anya told me that was the first one that was allowed to be built here. So that's something I want to look up on. Now, where do these things happen, and do they actually matter for urban planning, for example? Well, actually, I think they do. The very first article I ever wrote was about the business district of Hamburg, for a very different reason, just for urban planning purposes. And I went into the archives of Exxon, BP, Shell. So why would these be so big in these locations? Well, Exxon had some 36 buildings within the city of Hamburg. They couldn't manage all of these different offices anymore, and they pushed the city to realize a business district outside the city, where they could set up their huge headquarters with a hairdresser and a postal office, and you name it. So it was a little city in its own right. So that's the Exxon building on top. And as you start looking, and I was doing work on the capital of Europe, not looking for oil at all, and then I looked at La Défense, which was one of the plans for a capital of Europe. Well, what do you see? Exxon is the first to go out there and to discuss with the government why they would be there and how it would be built. Same story in Milan. The Centro di Decennale is built, first goes out, Exxon. So they're not having a specific concept, this is our architecture, our urban design, but by their sheer power, they will drive and promote specific forms of urbanization in countries that are far away from where they're located. But as said, some of them actually do architecture and urban planning. And my favorite example here is the city of Abadan. And in the early years, and this is planned by BP, BP has to build everything, pipelines, bridges, streets, and cities to actually get people into the deserts of Iran to be able to work there. So they have to relocate entire families, and they do that by setting up an urban model. So they bring the Garden City principle to Iran and call it modernization as part of the collaboration with the government. But look at this, somebody just asked about sustainability. So at the time, well, you were working back and back to the refinery. And the engineers would just run over if there was a problem, and the kids' playground were next to the refinery, and your tennis courts too, by the way. And this was celebrated up to the 1960s, where this beautiful postcard shows you the refinery and the houses nearby. And there's some remnants of this. There's a little housing city in Dunkirk, for example, also built by BP to host these engineers. So what does that mean even in more contemporary plans? So we have places like Dubai, where construction occurs through oil money here in the sea and is celebrated as the outcome. So the money is used for the outcome of the oil, even if it's not directly used for hosting the people. But it's also part of our culture. I mean, your neighboring country up here, Norway, is doing quite a good job at it. So they have managed to both use the oil funds and promote culture, and to make a very strong connection, I think, from the past to the contemporary into the future. And so the Petroleum Museum in Stavanger shows this well. So they're playing both with the aesthetics of oil tanks, they're telling you the story of oil and what they could be doing within the future. But I already said before, how do we deal with this heritage structure? So Sydney Park, BP Park in Sydney. Do we want in the future to reference these big oil companies throughout the world as being the ones who have shaped our culture and our environment? Shall we celebrate this heroic oil in the way they want us to? So in this case, they took out the storage tanks and kept the circles of the storage tanks and built the park around it, leaving some of the old remnants there. It's a question for those who are designers among you. But there are ways in which these companies really play with our minds. For example, a pedestrian bridge, BP Bridge, designed by Frank Gehry in Chicago. Well, they are attaching their names to things that are not necessarily the ones that they have built. And I have to say my favorite, I just can't not show it, is a LEED certified gas station. So you have, I think 11, 12 or whatever elements of LEED certification, water runoff, solar panels, you name it, as a box that hosts oil. That's not, I mean, how sustainable is that? And you could extrapolate it and say, well, we're talking, again, sustainability, we're talking about circular economies and making our big ports green. Well, but we won't count what goes through the ports. So if you transport petroleum, but your port is green, well, what does that mean? How do we think about that? Or in this case, Hamburg won the Green City Award in 2011, but all the cruise ships there are not counted. So they pollute, because they still don't have, there's only one ship now that links to the electric system. All the others even don't have this system. So they pollute worth 100,000 cars when they are in the port. So where's our, how do we calculate? How can we say Paris is sustainability if they don't count the airport? I mean, all of these kinds of things are things we should be looking into. And I said the oil companies have been very, in the countries with them, have been very careful in using every product more and more efficiently. So if you have heavy fuels with a lot of bitumen in there, you can't really use it unless you build streets. So they built the King Fuad way throughout Egypt with the leftover products. And in some ways, the cathedrals of our times are the highways, because they're also made of asphalt on top of them. That's a petroleum product we're rolling out throughout our landscapes. So, I said we're looking at the spaces, and I gave you an idea of these, maybe not of all of them yet, but let's look at one more thing, and that's, I just mentioned, well, medicine is one, and plastic is the other. So, as we have now managed to claim the landscape more and more, what happens in our houses? Well, you see the celebration, it was just so cute that I had to show it. But by 1943, and this is a wartime accomplishment, the plastic industry goes into the building sector. So plastics as a, not plastics in general, but plastics as a petroleum-based element. And we have a very interesting collaboration between Monsanto, a chemical company, MIT, an academic institution, and Disneyland. And they will create the house of the future. So by in the 1957, this was the place you were supposed to live in. So a complete prefabricated plastic thing that would host all of your needs with all kinds of really great technology at the time, microwaves and so on. There's actually very cool YouTube films that you can see how it looked inside. We didn't get this, but what did we get? We got plastics in buildings. And when you start taking your own house apart, you will find plastic almost everywhere. From your floor, not in this beautiful building, but from your floor to your paint, to your probably even the curtains. And if you go further, I always ask my students, strip off your plastic. I think there would be a lot of clothes dropped in this room, and handphones, and clocks, and watches, and so on. And for example, Japan is a really great example, because the megastructuralists like Kurokawa already invented plastic elements that you could pop into your buildings for the nomadic lifestyle. And this is what, well, you have your Barbie bathroom, but you also have a typical bathroom in Japan, which is just a single plastic unit popped into your very small buildings. So the plastic story is one that I think is fascinating and that merits further development. But let's look quickly at philanthropy. And Life already pointed out in the 1970s, oh, look, this is the oil story, and yes, we had to break up the big Standard Oil collaboration in 1911, but there's also the philanthropies. And philanthropy is a very American concept. And I always wondered, because most of my American colleagues would say, oh, no, Rockefeller does Rockefeller stuff, and Standard Oil is Standard Oil, they don't have anything to do with each other. Stop laughing, Lou. So I tried to go, I went into the Rockefeller archives also to look, well, where did they invest? So most of the time, the location they choose, so they go into China with the oil, but they also go into China with the philanthropy. And so what they built is a lot of medical facilities, as the Peking Union Medical College that you see up here. But perhaps the example that I find most striking in terms of how the two work together is the one of Williamsburg. Williamsburg in Virginia. Has anybody been there? Okay, well you should go. It's actually a very nice site. If you go to the US, this is sort of the birthplace of America. The first speeches were given there, so it's an old colonial city with the governor's palace, a main street, the capital, and now. So it's a place where they celebrate the birth of America. Rockefeller Jr. came by in the 30s, bought the house, the White House up there, and invested heavily in the reconstruction. Well, it's a very nice gesture. But once you go into the archives, you see a lot of articles where you see Rockefeller family members with the Queen of England, with the Emperor of Japan. This is a city with horse carts and so on, so you have all these fancy images. And then you find all the letters about them, the Rockefeller families, hosting business partner from Latin America in the hotels of this location. So it's high politics that are actually being played out, and you can't really argue that these are completely disconnected. And then Standard Oil also had promotional videos to get people to travel. And that's the next aspect we look at. So what is it that these oil companies are selling us? Here, nature, wilderness. That's where you go. And even if you look at all these beautiful free handout maps of the gas stations, what's the Netherlands about? It's not about refineries, it's about tulips and windmills and cute little houses. And maybe Germany has a different story to tell, it's more about modernist architecture. But the point is, go travel. And in general, the advertisements of the time were all about beauty. So your refinery, even by the 1980s, I mean in the 1870s, the one that I showed you in the beginning, I can still believe it, but by the 1980s, having a refinery still within this kind of bucolic landscape is not quite believable. But what is fascinating to see, and a student of mine looked into this, the oil companies almost anticipated societal change. So they will speak to gender issues that you asked before. For example, they have a booklet, Eva Learns to Drive. So they tell women that they also can use the car and just multiply the company's business. Or later on, it's about Shell Helps You, is a huge campaign, and then you have a woman driving a huge truck through the woods, and then a wolf appears in her trunk, and then she drives to the gas station, and the men come running out, and then you have a big sign, Shell Helps You. So they are playing with our societal interests and desires. And now they are playing with sustainability. I mean, those are kinds of the imaginations that we see. But architecture has also done its part of it, and we often forget when we teach architecture and urban history that many of these are oil stories. Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin was funded by a car maker, and this is a story about cars. Frank Lloyd Wright, Broadacre City, is the basis for American suburban sprawl, and it can only be done through individual transportation. But perhaps the one that fascinates me most is the 1939 World's Fair. And so this started with the designer, whom we see up here there, Norman Dalgetty's, making a publicity campaign for Shell. And he was designing the city of the future, huge highways and skyscrapers. And General Motors thought, oh, well, that's a nice story. So that's how the Pavilion of the Future came around in this 1939 exhibition. And you could say that is then what was built after World War II. So we have architects getting these kinds of inspirations from refineries, and artists documenting the stories of transformation. And here are the things that you probably have all grown up with. The Lego toys, which only recently switched to non-petroleum-based plastic, and even the Lego cities that celebrate the Rockefeller Center. So there are a lot of challenges in terms of heritage studies. What are we going to do with these sites? How are we going to clean them up? Your future agendas. How are we designing the transition away? These are easy. Petroleum museums, they write the heroic stories, or a couple of gas stations that we preserve. But what about the storage tanks? Those are easy to clean up. But what about these? And we have to be very careful about the kind of iconic buildings that we create. So this is Adam Tower in Amsterdam, which used to be the Shell headquarters, recently revived. So I think, and also in terms of our new urban agendas, we have to shift people's minds. Just as we either go out of space, we might also go on the micro level. And this is a very famous painting in the Netherlands, the milkmaid, pouring milk. Well, we've transformed her, Jenna Arts, a young illustrator, transformed her into pouring oil. She also did this one, which I love, which is the small house in Delft, which is now fitted out with the one to the right. But in the last 5 minutes, I just want to take you quickly to the Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Antwerp area, which is the second biggest petroleum hub after Houston, which you really don't think when you've seen all those tulips and windmills. So just look at the growth of petroleum over 150 years. And so the petroleum is the red spaces in the growth of the port. So most of the petroleum in the Netherlands actually goes to Germany. And the competition between Antwerp and Rotterdam was all about getting the stuff into the German hinterland. And that's also the competition with Bremerhaven. But when you look at the spatial patterns, and this is the kind of mapping we've been doing, is that you see, this is 1910, so the early period of cars. The headquarters and the decision-making is already in The Hague, just as the decision-making was in New York or in other of the big places. And there's a concrete letter where these companies say, we want to be next to the ministries. We need to influence decision-making. And it translates into money. So by 1940, when cars were still rising in Europe, it's very hard to see for you because these are tiny little yellow dots. But I tell you, there's about 10, 12 yellow dots in The Hague, and only 2 in Rotterdam. Well, the money is where the decision makers are, that's where the nice leisure places are, that's where the big houses are, etc. And this is how it grows. So the growth of the oil in the port is accompanied by the growth of the oil in the decision-making center and by the growth of the oil throughout the landscape. And so we are looking now at both narrowing it down on very concrete spaces, but also on looking at oil around the North Sea, and I hope to take it to the Baltic at some point. So the project that Christian just mentioned on the urbanization of the ocean is one that's happening outside at Delft now. So we're looking at what happens inside the ocean in terms of infrastructures, shipping lanes, but also drilling towers, legal separation of those spaces, and so on. And I know there's a panel on augmented reality and virtual reality here. So what we did was, and I'm just going to let it run in the background, there's only some music anyway. So what we try to do is help people put on the oil lens, and so there's on the one hand a website called oilscapes.nl, where people could ideally add their stories about oil into this website and photograph these buildings, because even as urban as historians, those are not sources we can easily get. To map the gas stations, we had to look in old telephone books, because there's no archives that are easily accessible. So as historians, we have to come up with new ways of finding the material, of exploring it, and even thinking about new material. Working on Le Corbusier is easy. Well, everybody knows where the archives are. But there's much more to do if we want to tell very different stories. And so the other thing that we did in there is then to come up with an augmented reality tool. And so when you look outside the faculty building in Delft, you would see little oil drops that show you where oil is. And that could be anything from the gas station that you would expect to, we actually have a whole petroleum department, where we have a lot of people sent from Saudi Arabia, paid by the government to study in Delft. But you also find very cute things or unexpected things. I found the expatriate wives of The Hague, or the Petroleum Club of The Hague, something like that. So institutions that you would even not expect to exist will all of a sudden be linked. And what we like to do with it too is that you could take the tool through the city and that you can see the historical development. So here again is the Amsterdam Tower, the former Shell buildings. See it over time and start playing with it, ideally to understand what are the networks that connected around the world. But, I mean, you could take put yourself as a selfie in the old photos, but you could also use it as a design tool and to think about what does this transition mean and how could we actually achieve it. So the one other thing that I want to just finish off with is that I'm doing also a studio on architecture and urbanism beyond oil, and we've done it for Rotterdam, and we're now doing it for Dunkirk. We're also designing an exhibition for Dunkirk. But what students need to understand, it's so easy that someone comes in, oh, let's just do housing in the port of Rotterdam. Not going to happen. The soil is too polluted. There is no infrastructure. But in order to get people actually to understand what it takes and to design this transition, to come up with new urban agendas, we also need to change minds. And we have to surprise people and ask them, is this going to be the heritage that you are going to be celebrating? The Dutch windmills, the Dutch canals were engineering devices. So where are the new imaginaries of solar panels, or you name it? And so that's the kind of stuff we do now in the studio for Dunkirk. The art that I'm finishing off here, so if you want, what I just told has actually just come out, so there's an open access article that you can read, and just to leave you with a final image, just to compete with Christian, and just put it in the end. So this is a recent book that just came out that you might want to look at. So this is the Routledge Handbook of Planning History, which is not about the oil topic, but what I tried to do specifically is to bring in, to provincialize Europe, America, and the United States, and to bring in stories of planning history from China, Southeast Asia, Africa, and other places that have a very different approach and knowledge. What is urbanism? What is planning history? And then there's this one, which is another series, but so you can't touch them, but I'm happy to talk about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I have to really think about it for a time. I think for me it was really interesting how invisible the petroleum escapes are, and then once someone points it out to you, it's like, yes, it's everywhere. And you sort of, I had a question, and you, towards the end, you started answering it a little bit, but I found it very interesting, this thing about this oil nostalgia, the gas stations and the heritage and all that. And what we've seen in many cities is that these old industrial areas, not necessarily oil, everything else, they become cultural hubs, and they a little rundown, but they're filled with artists, and it's happened, I mean, we have it here in Helsinki and in most cities, I would say. So now, what would you think, is there a risk of if we keep using these, maybe it's like a post-petroleum scape, or maybe towards sustainability should be an anti-petroleum scape, because if we keep them as icons, we still value them, and maybe we shouldn't.
I think we have to come up with the right narrative, just as we have narratives about other pieces of history, that we put them into a perspective. So what is the perspective that we want to have on this heroic oil? And I think the difference with many of the other sites, but there's two things. One is these big companies usually leave stuff they don't need anymore to the city. So that's the story of waterfront regeneration. So those sites don't work anymore, so everybody else can take care of it. And you have, in the case of waterfronts, in the case of even the coal industry, that works. There are places that artists can just take over. But you're not going to take over a refinery like this. And this challenge is, just to give you one example we're dealing with in Dunkirk, there's a huge legal battle. You have to take out the soil under the refinery that has closed. So Rotterdam, 2 refineries have closed. How do you do that? How deep do you go? So the company says, we take out 4 meters, but we're not going to go deeper because it was bombed in the war, and that's when the oil seeped into the ground. So who's going to take out the next 5, 6, 7, whatever meters underneath, and who's going to pay for it? So I think the level of difficulty of cleaning up these sites is not something that we can resolve with those creative cities practices. And maybe the return to nature, to create actual new type of nature that eats up the oil and that that resolves some of the problems for us, rather than putting it directly into human use again.
Great, thank you. Any questions? We have 2 microphones.
Thank you. I'm Mikael Sorre, teacher from Espoo, the most sustainable city in the Europe, at a very good Dutch university. I visited in Rotterdam and Den Haag last week, and I saw a lot of new skyscrapers in Rotterdam city. Can you see the new buildings as a symbol of sustainable development in Rotterdam, or are they still symbols of oil companies and cargo of petroleum industry? Or how do you see the new skyscrapers in Rotterdam?
That's a good question. The new VP headquarters has a green roof. Does that satisfy you? But I think as long, and that's what I'm trying to say, the system is so big that we are not going to resolve it by putting a couple of windmills into the port. And so, for example, Rotterdam Green Port has this label and is going for this label, and I want to look this up further, but somebody recently told me that the CO2 of the port is pumped into the glass houses. So when you have the Rotterdam port next to it, you have all these glass houses that produce the tomatoes. I guess they come up to Helsinki and other places too, that are sent throughout the world. The Netherlands is, I think, the 4th biggest exporter of agriculture. So the CO2 that the plants need comes from the ports. Before, they were burning wood to produce CO2 to get these tomatoes bigger, or the strawberries, or you name it. Now, it appears, but this is something to be checked up on, that the plants only absorb 2% of the CO2, which means that the rest goes in the air. So instead of letting it go directly into the air of the port, they get green credit for pumping it to the gas houses and letting it out there. So there's so many tricks in this system. And I teach one course on building green, and I always ask the students, the final project is to critique a building that is recently celebrated as being the greenest of all. And I think one of them was actually about Espoo. I should look up that paper. So I challenged them to take the people, planet, profit approach and to decompose the sustainability narrative behind a building, a site, or a location, and to see what are they missing. And I think that it's a very interesting exercise, because it forces us to think about what do we actually mean with sustainability. So there will probably be a number of buildings with all kinds of passive energy features and so on and so forth in the Netherlands. But and there are, and several of them are good, several of them are my colleagues, don't get me wrong, and it's a big thing that Theodels does, but I do think there's many more steps that we have to take to understand the systemic implications of how petroleum has shaped our landscapes and how we can actually get out of it. By having all of this suburbia, we're almost forced to continue using these